Thanks for downloading this episode from Teachers Talk Radio. You can find the full schedule and listen back to all our shows at ttradio.org. This show is brought to you in partnership with the Witherslack Group, experts in special education and care, and John Catt Educational, leading publishers of books, directories, educational guides and magazines specifically aimed at schools in the UK and beyond. Enjoy the podcast.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, a leading publisher of books, directories, educational guides and magazines specifically aimed at forward-thinking schools in the UK and beyond. Have you checked out their latest releases? Don't miss out! Visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. Happy reading!
This episode of Teachers Talk Radio has been made possible with support from Witherslack Group, the UK's leading provider of SEN education and care. They're here to support you too through an ever-growing offer of free resources, including webinars, podcasts, articles, and events aimed at supporting teaching professionals like you. Visit their website at www.witherslackgroup.co.uk to find out more.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Teachers Talk Radio on the Sunday Social. It's me, Tom Rogers. Unfortunately, Jasmine is not here with you as usual today, but she will be back very, very soon. Got a really exciting program for you this morning and also tomorrow at 7:30. I've got the second of this sort of double header on the future of education with Daisy Christodoulou and Khalil Rouse tomorrow night as well, which is at 7:30. This one, similar sort of theme and questions. I've got Catherine Darwin and I've got Tom Sherrington, and we are going to be talking about the future of education. Particularly when it comes to some of the challenges we're currently facing, perhaps some of the trends that are around at the moment, and how we think things might pan out, or how we predict things might go. Perhaps some of the things that we worry about, or perhaps some of the things we want to keep that we think might vanish. Just before we get into that, just to remind you, today's show is sponsored by John Catt Education, which is a leading publisher of educational content, books, magazines, and educational resources. If you want to find out more about John Catt, just visit johncattbookshop.com and you can find out more about what they have on offer. And our second sponsor is Witherslack Group. You can see them pinned to the space at the moment. They've got lots of webinars coming up soon, including one that you can see listed called ADHD and Autism, Managing Sibling Relationships. And you can literally click on the link in the pinned tweet to sign up for that. Because I'm sure that will be a topic that will be very interesting to lots of our listeners. You might be listening back to this as a podcast. If you are, welcome, whether you're driving, walking, wherever you are, whatever you're doing. It is always good to have you with us on Teachers Talk Radio. It might even be that you're thinking, oh, perhaps I could be a host on Teachers Talk Radio. Well, please do. We've got 50 or more hosts and contributors on the station, and we are always looking for new hosts and new people who would like to get involved. So if that is you, then just go to the website. There is a little thing that says host on there, and you can fill in the form and join us. Catherine, good morning.
Morning.
Hello, how are you?
Yeah, really good, thank you. Well, I'm lying. I'm recovering from a chest infection, so if I just stop speaking for a bit, it's probably because I can't breathe. But yeah, apart from that, all good.
Yes, very good to have you with us. I will introduce you, as your Twitter bio says, as the Executive Princess of Maths.
Yeah, that is me. We decided at one point that there were a lot of silly names going around for people's jobs. Just appearing at some stage, and so there was a collective of us that kind of just made up our own titles, and Executive Princess is obviously more important than just being a princess, isn't it? So
Brilliant. Well, you know what? We've known each other for a while, and you are a certified legend and an amazing maths teacher. It's brilliant to have you sort of on the show this morning. And we've also got Tom. Tom, good morning.
Hello, good. It's good to be here. I finally cracked the code of how to enter, and I'm glad to finally have found my way in.
Well, brilliant. You've just missed me introducing Catherine as the executive princess of maths, which she has on her Twitter bio, which I'm guessing makes you the executive principal of walkthroughs. See what I did there?
Yeah, very clever. Very good. Yeah.
Amazing. But yeah, you both, I mean, basically what we're going to do, we're going to be going through sort of talking about the past, the present, but particularly the future of education and the landscape, and what we think might change, what we think might stay the same, what we think we need to keep, what we think we need to throw away, and so on and so forth. Tom, do you want to give a little bit more of an introduction to yourself to listeners? Because some might be listening back as a podcast and might not know who you are.
Okay, well, I used to be a teacher and a head teacher for about 30 years altogether. And then for the last 5 years, I've just been working in schools to do mainly CPD training, and I've written some books about teaching, including most recently the Walkthroughs series. So that's me.
Brilliant. And Catherine, I don't want to just leave it at Executive Princess of Maths. So maybe you could just tell people your actual job role at the moment.
Yeah, so I'm a lead practitioner of maths and teaching at an inner city school in Leeds. Just a bit obsessive about teaching and maths, really. That's me down to a T.
Brilliant. So, Tom, we're going to start with a question which I think is on everyone's lips at the moment. How can we stop teachers leaving teaching? Because every time I speak to a teacher at the moment, they are A, considering leaving, B, on the verge of leaving, or C, they're saying that they are just out on their feet, they can't carry on, and therefore they're sort of, I guess that the next logical step is that they consider leaving. So how can we stop teachers leaving teaching?
Well, I just want to just come in before you say that and say, I meet lots of teachers. I meet lots and lots of teachers, and I don't hear that all the time. So I want to just sort of, I know it's there are challenges, and I know that recruitment has been lower than usual, and I know that it's not easy, but I actually meet a lot of teachers who love their job. So, and I think that's part of the solution, is that you have to sort of think, why is it that so many teachers actually really love it, and why do so many school leaders just absolutely love their job, and then flip that round? Because I think there's issues to do with pay, and the unions are balloting at the moment for strike action on pay, and I think that's an obvious area. Pay people should feel well rewarded for being a teacher, because it is a demanding job. So that's one aspect, of course, and I think that it's not surprising that unions are balloting for strike action, because that's a sort of a natural thing to do when you feel like you're not being listened to by government through pay reviews and so on. But I think wider than that, I think there are school cultures and school situations where the job is just made too difficult, in terms of things like, and even here, I feel like there are some improvements being made. I mean, compared with a few years ago, I mean, I actually think things have got better in most of the schools I go to. So, there are fewer pointless data drops, for example. There's more like professional development orientated processes. The accountability cultures are sort of getting a little bit more intelligent. But I just still feel like that work needs to carry on. The workload agenda needs to be taken far more seriously. So that is a balance of things, isn't it? It's a whole mix of these things.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the reason I was asking that is more, I guess, the observations on around that. For example, people, not a week goes by where I don't see social media posts or even just conversations about, we're struggling to recruit, we can't get enough people to apply, but also, as I say, people sort of saying, I'm thinking of going. But I agree with you. I mean, of course. I mean, even the teachers who want to leave teaching love teaching. I mean, it's highly rare that you find a teacher who leaves because they just think, oh, do you know what? I went into teaching and actually teaching's rubbish. I don't like it. It's highly rare. Like sometimes, yeah, like 1 out of every however, you might get that. But usually it's not because they don't love teaching that teachers leave. In my sort of perception, in my experience of talking to people, it's because of other issues that are not necessarily to do with the kids or the teaching or the classroom space, but it's more to do with what happens beyond that or around that. But yeah, I think learning from, I mean, what you mentioned there, Tom, about culture and stuff like that. I mean, what do you think we can learn for the future about culture? I mean, you mentioned some of the things there in terms of less sort of data drops and assessment points, but is there anything? I mean, what would be your key things there?
I think I think one of the things that teachers love is a feeling of autonomy, of feeling that you're allowed to make choices and you're not constantly being judged and scrutinized. And I feel like the best cultures manage to create a culture where there's a professional development energy around the school, where people feel they're on a kind of mission, that we're trying to do something work together. So they're allowed to, there's a kind of a talking and some processes around professional development which don't feel like scrutiny. And that's like, for some people, a hard balance to strike. Like it's genuinely supportive, and you talk to people and they're looking forward to their team meetings because they have been given the autonomy to run them in a way which solves the problems they've got, rather than it always being doing stuff that other people have told them to do. So I feel like if I see so many schools, and there's a whole axis of things where I just think, wow, there's such variation. And if all the best things happened in every school, I think a lot of teachers would stay. So that would be things like time for meetings is kind of managed well, and it's quite frequent for sort of the main thing, which is like your curriculum team. Some schools have hardly any time to talk about their curriculum, so they're constantly sort of running on fumes. It's things like resourcing, things like materials for teaching, having a visualizer, all this sort of thing. It's just like, it's not a big deal. It's just there. You just sort it out. You have the stuff you need. It's not a big ask. And I meet schools where the teachers feel they've got lovely spaces, they've got lovely equipment, they've got all the resources they need. They've got loads of CPD time. It's a supportive SLT. There's someone who, that there's a great behaviour system, and all those things are just there. And you think, wow, it's just a lovely place to work. And when you go to the toilet, it doesn't feel like you've gone to some sort of 1970s train station, and it feels like you're treated like a human being.
I genuinely think, and I kind of intimated this in a tweet I put out last night about pay, is that, I genuinely, like, in the past, when I left an experience in a school where I left halfway through a year, I left with no job to go to. If the school building was beautiful, right, and it was, it was pretty well resourced. I just think that, for me, and this is me personally talking now, I'm not talking for anyone else at all, but like, you could sort of put me in a shed. I mean, the first 5 years of my career, I taught in a porter cabin in a field, and the porter cabin was falling apart. I mean, the porter cabin wasn't touched in those entire 5 years that I was there at all. There was paint flaking off the walls. There was the floorboards creaked when students walked around the room. It was like, if someone hit a football, because it was like right in the middle of the field, so people used to smash footballs against it, all the time and whatever. But you know what? Because of the culture of that school, I was perfectly happy. You could have put me in a shed, and I'd have still sort of got on with the job and made that situation, that classroom, my own, and tried to, because I love teaching. I love the teaching element of it. So I'm not saying it wouldn't have made it harder. It would have, but would it have made me quit? Would it have made me consider leaving the profession? Probably not. So I agree with you. Like, the buildings are mint if you've got a lovely building, but I don't know. Like, it's
just part of the whole set of ideas, though. So I mean, all these things add together to a sense of feeling invested in. And of course, the reason I say those things is because in the schools where I notice those things, it's like the teachers can just take them for granted because they're just expected. But when teachers don't have the things they need, it's just another thing which is just pointlessly frustrating, and then takes up time, takes up energy. And you're right, but it probably does. The school culture is a really interesting thing, isn't it? Because that I meet a lot of school leaders, and I always meet these people who are the sort of super enthusiastic person responsible for teaching, learning, and CPD, and those people nearly always just love their jobs, and then SLTs are mean well around what they're trying to do. But sometimes when you talk to teachers about what it feels like to be on the receiving end of some of these processes, they still perceive it all as imposition and scrutiny, and I think that's one of the key reasons that people find teaching frustrating, is when they feel just over scrutinized. And the reason you're doing it isn't for you or for your class, it's because you're meeting someone else's need to, from a leadership point of view. So I think SLTs need to think really hard about that real balance of letting teachers feel like they are who they are, they can be themselves, they can express themselves, and the extent to which you control what people do needs to be really thought hard about. What are you really getting a net gain to your school by making people all do that thing?
Do you think though? Do you think though that consistency, because that word consistency, there's some who would say, yeah, it's super important. There's others who would say, no, because by forcing every teacher in a school to have those sort of non-negotiables and all the rest of it, that's terrible. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, I get sort of triggered by the word non-negotiable, because I think it's a ludicrous word. Basically, there are things which I think it's the opposite. There are lots of things schools do consistently because they have explicitly been negotiated. In other words, we've agreed on these things. So when you have been part of a process where you say, look, should we all try to work on this approach to teaching because it's a sensible idea and it helped the children speak better or whatever, and you go, yeah, okay, let's all do this. There's some sort of collective endeavour. I feel like the consistency comes through people buying into something because they all see it as a sensible thing to be working on, but it's explicitly negotiated. It's like it's a negotiable, whatever the opposite of non-negotiable. It doesn't mean everyone goes off and does their own thing. In fact, this is one thing that I find really interesting, is that the schools I find are happiest, teachers are autonomous within a spirit of collaborative endeavour, that they feel they're part of something that they're doing together. There's a sort of really strong team spirit. And it could be the maths department. The maths department has this sense of, we're the maths department, we're all doing it together. And we're not all off going doing whatever we like in our classroom, but the team itself feels sort of autonomous within the whole school. And that's a lovely feeling. I find those are the most positive places, the little team offices of teams of teachers feeling great about what they're doing together. And that it's where the autonomy sits, isn't it? At each individual teacher's door, it's in the unit that they're part of. So being part of something is hugely rewarding, and I think that's something which sometimes doesn't get enough focus.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Catherine, how can we stop teachers leaving teaching?
It's really interesting listening to Tom speak about kind of what happens within a school there, because when you asked me that question, it was kind of totally different the way I was like framing it, because I came from a career outside of teaching before I was a teacher.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so I was a trainee actuary for 3 years, and it wasn't for me. I like people too much to look at spreadsheets, but I think that the respect I got as a member of that profession, and the kind of reward I got from being kind of monetarily and also kind of in the balance of my life, and the investment I felt in kind of my development in that kind of structure, was a lot more than I think the status of teaching as a profession has got. And I think that is part of the problem for teachers leaving, but also teachers or anyone thinking of becoming a teacher. Joining a grad scheme that needs exactly the same qualifications as teaching pays significantly better. You know, you're going to have a better work-life balance. They're going to invest into these professional qualifications for you, and you are valued for doing the job that you are doing, as opposed to kind of being pushed higher and higher up the ranks if you are doing well. And so I think that for me, it's about kind of trying to mirror that within teaching a little bit, and that kind of sense of having a status as a profession of teachers and being valued for being good at your job and being invested in terms of your professional development for that, I think is really, really important. And I think I've been quite lucky with that in the schools that I've been in, but I know it's not the case for every single person that they're in a school that respects that. But I think it's wider than necessarily just the school that you're in as well. I think that as a nation, we potentially don't hold teachers to the standard that they should be held as a profession. It is a profession, it's not just a job. And so for me, that's where it lies a little bit. It's bigger than just the school you're in. All of those things individually can be lovely in a school, but there are so many schools across the country, and not all of those things can kind of be controlled by the school itself.
Tom, any thoughts on that from Catherine?
No, I agree. I feel like I think there's a government aspect to this. I think in terms of recruitment, I think that ultimately the government's responsibility is to make sure there's a supply of teachers into the profession. Schools can't control that directly, and they can play a part in it. And there's lots of aspects of this. There's sort of the multiple routes into teaching, I think, is good, and we do have that. But sometimes I still feel it's too complicated. I know that people I've spoken to about, how would I going about becoming a teacher? Where do I go to find out? And I know there is a website, but it's so fragmented. It's a bit of a minefield to get in. And then there's some advertising that goes on, and I think some of the adverts are good. I think they present teaching kind of how it is, they're kind of the spirit of being a teacher, and I like those. But you think, well, you've got to put your money where your mouth is. You've got to say, well, so I think the pay aspect is key. In terms of public perception, I think that's always going to be a problem. And, how do you legislate to change public opinion about teaching and its status broadly? I think it comes through sort of the accumulation over time of, politicians and pundits sort of bigging up the profession much more explicitly. And I don't think there's enough of that. Especially in the kind of the ordinary sense of it. You often get the kind of the doe-eyed, teary story of the teacher that changed my life, and I think that's all lovely, but that's not the reality of teaching month to month. Which is about teaching students to add fractions more effectively, which doesn't seem very glamorous, but it is really the main job. You don't have to change someone's life to be a really great teacher. You just have to teach them some stuff they didn't know. And I think the kind of the main thrust of teaching gets sort of slightly masked by this need to be the kind of the ultimate savior kind of thing. And there's not enough messaging just around that really important thing of the job schools and teachers do, to teach children stuff they that they need to know, and celebrating curriculum and all that kind of thing. It just doesn't get enough airtime.
Yeah, Catherine, I mean, are you an ultimate saviour in maths teaching?
Wow, that's a big question, Tom. I don't think that there are any teachers that's like their aim. Do you know what I mean? They don't want to be heralded as this ultimate saviour and kind of the best thing since sliced bread. I mean, obviously that would be lovely, but actually 99% of the time, all you want to do is make sure that the kids in front of you understand a little bit more about the subject that you love. And for me, I think that's the reason that I love the job. Being in that classroom with those kids, like Tom said, like that bit that is like the actual bit of the job, getting them to understand something, getting them to like build those relationships with you and therefore enjoy your subject a little bit more is probably the best part of it. And I think Tom's absolutely right in saying, there is no way to legislate how people see that teaching, that public perception. But I think it's up to us as teachers to maybe promote that side of it that is less about the, whinging about the things that are going wrong or whatever, and actually thinking like, these are the bits that make my job the best thing it could possibly be, and then we make it a profession. We talk about how it can be, and I think I really enjoy the kind of drive for things like the Teach Me Icons CPD, and kind of from a maths perspective, things like the maths comps and even the Chartered College of Teaching and stuff like that, that's really allowing us to take ownership of that, I think is really lovely. But I just don't think it's as widely known outside of our circles. I think we need to shout about it a little bit more, that we love this and this is why.
I mean, this is interesting, because it leads me on to my next question. Tom, I'll ask you this one. So we started with how can we stop teachers leaving teaching, but I want to ask, how can we get the profession heard more by politicians? So is it about the unions? Is it about the Chartered College? Is it about something else? Because there are those who would say, on the sort of cynical side, that the profession is still not really being heard effectively. The teacher voice, if you like, is not coming through. It's not there enough. Despite lots and lots of these programs and investments and new initiatives, we've got the National Institute of Teaching now, and there's lots of these bodies, but there are still those who say, look, the profession is still not being heard from that sort of grassroots level.
Yeah, it's interesting all that. I mean, I think there's one of those bodies there. I mean, I don't even knew about it. I mean, it's I think low profile. I think I think there are things that I go to where there are times where I've said to people, I mean, I do think, apart from the pay aspect, which I think is really an important issue, but in terms of things that Catherine's talking about there, the access to the debate and the discussion, I don't think there's been a better time for teachers than now, in terms of the spirit of sharing and access to information. And I'm a massive fan and supporter of research ed things, where there's so many of these events you go to. And I've got an event next week, which is a charity event, a day online on Zoom, talking about Rosenshine's principles. Like 300 people have signed up. You think, there's this appetite for this stuff. It's absolutely fantastic. People are kind of excited about it, and there's a energy, there's a spirit of it, which I just think is fantastic, and I love it. And so do all the people doing it. So why isn't that the general perception? And I think we need to invite people to see that and understand that's what it's about. I think one of the problems is that, and this has been said many times, is that the teaching profession isn't a homogenous body. There's a lot of people debating and discussing, and there are some quite ferocious debates about what schools are for, and what the purposes of education are. And so we don't have a kind of united voice because we aren't united. And I think that's part of the challenge, that you've got to have multiple different people, getting politicians to see what's happening. But there's always going to be some division in the alignment between certain groups of teachers promoting certain ideas, and certain schools of thought around leadership. You get some schools get lionized for their particularly niche way of doing stuff, and other schools that do the main heavy lifting in the profession. This is going to lead into a whole other beef, so I'm going to get sidetracked on this. But I actually think that the schools that do the hardest work and the most important work in the system get hardly any attention at all. And
what do you mean by that, though? Can you sort of
explain that? Let's say a school which has got the existing staff, existing students, and is a full sort of comprehensive school, unglamorous area, and just doing great work, and probably as good work as anyone else could. Those schools are not running off the tip of your tongue, are they? Because there's hundreds of them, and so therefore they don't stand out. But that is where most children get educated, and they do incredible work. And so I just think that mainstream of main type of school, main type of area is really incredible work. It's probably the most creative, innovative stuff that goes on, is how you take a school with existing teachers and students and make it better than it was before. That process is not given as much credibility as the shiny schools which started new, which did what they wanted, and nearly every school that's famous started from scratch in the last 10 years. And I think that's ludicrous, because the best schools I go to aren't those schools. They're the ones where they've had to grind it out over a long, long time. And I think that's the sort of thing where teachers who work in those schools feel like, what about us? So come and visit us on your first day as a minister, because this is where the action is. Yeah. So I feel that's part of it. You need to celebrate the core practice and make teachers see that this is the real thing. And of course they could do things better or differently, but that's part of the excitement that's happening. People are recognizing that.
Yeah. Catherine, I'm going to ask you the same question in a second. Just before I do, just to say welcome to everybody who's listening. We've got lots of people joining us this morning. Good morning, Jonathan. Mrs. Lloyd, who's one of our regular listeners on Teachers Talk Radio. Welcome to you. Brent Poland, another one of our hosts. Mr. Green, Mark, Nadira, Lucy, Lindsay, Leanne, Sarita, Pip, Freya, Chris, Miss N, Mark, Elizabeth, Charlotte, Anika, Leslie, Paul, Sasha, Alex, Rory. There we go. I feel like I'm doing the register or something. But anyway, Catherine, what do you think then in terms of, how can we get the profession heard more by politicians?
I think that what Tom said there is really interesting about the divisions within teaching and not feeling like something always represents you. There's even that within just the small kind of set of maths associations that there are. There's like this battle of kind of the types of teaching that go on, and what one thinks is better versus the other. Whereas I'm a member of both of them, because I think that it's really interesting to hear both viewpoints and try and learn from both of them. And I think that actually, potentially, that's what needs to happen. Like the chartered college, or whatever that kind of body is going to be for us, there needs to be one of them that is just a space for us to talk about the things that we think are good teaching, the things that we think need to happen in teaching, and how we need to be supported. And it doesn't have to be a united voice per se. It just needs to be a space where we know that kind of conversation and discussion can happen, and it is representative of us all in some way. It doesn't have to be everything they say is representative of us, but that there needs to be somewhere where we feel like we can voice our opinions and they will be heard in some way, and bring that kind of, I guess, professional debate into it, because sometimes that is what we need. We need to be seen as the profession. We need to have those discussions together, and actually having those separate places is probably making us more divided than it is united.
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily think there's an answer to that, but I do. My opinion is that the profession, despite a lot of these organizations and groups existing, I'm still not sure how clearly teacher voice comes through at policy level and at governmental level. And maybe in the future, you would hope that can change. You would hope that teachers can have more of a voice, and perhaps some or of those organizations can initiate or enable that. But it's an interesting one. Tom, the future in terms of sort of education. I'm going to read, there's an interesting article by Forbes which came out a couple of months ago, and the title of the article was "The Two Biggest Future Trends in Education." And one of the things they wrote was, education at all levels must evolve to teach children the skills they need to thrive in our changing world. Many of the jobs today's school children will work in don't exist yet. LinkedIn predicts 150 million new technology jobs in the next 5 years, and almost all the roles in LinkedIn's Jobs on the Rise report for 2022 can already be done remotely. What do you think of that, Tom?
I think what is the implication for education? And I actually feel like the more sort of future speaky those sort of people become, the more I just think the most important thing you need to be doing in education is give children a rounded, broad education based on what we currently understand as the kind of main disciplines or that represent being educated. and focus on students knowing that as well as possible, and not try to sort of second guess some future world, which is, whatever that is. The thing I notice when I go to schools, the thing that pains me more than anything when I visit schools is just how hard it is for some kids to learn but very basic things. And when I look at a kid who's struggling, they're not struggling because the curriculum isn't sort of future orientated enough. It's because they're still struggling to put numbers on a number line, or articulate a sentence properly, or express themselves in writing. And what they don't need is some other curriculum. They just need the curriculum that's there to be given the time to be taught really well. And it's sort of that will prepare them best. And I think business leaders are really unhelpful when they think that people should be leaving school and going into the workplace with this sort of nebulous sense of like team skills and stuff. I mean, what even is that? And if team skills in one job isn't the same as another, just if you need them to do certain things when they arrive to your company, then bloody train them to do it. Schools can't prepare people for the factory floor. That's ludicrous. They should be teaching kids to have confidence in lots of subjects, to understand their place in the world, to know why we bang on about climate change, to read some books, to be able to understand the world around them. And that is what an educated citizen is. And they've got some agency around their own study, so they've learned to pursue some lines of inquiry on their own, that type of thing. But that is the future. It's doing the stuff we know really well, and technology can help that with things like assessment packages and stuff like that. But it's not going to write this whole future speak stuff. It's a distraction, gets in the way.
Do you think, though, that, I know like David Blunkett recently produced a report for Labour where he talks about getting more creativity into the classroom, and he even mentioned in the report, very controversially, about sort of chalk and talk teaching and moving more away from that and thinking about the skills that students need, and a more creative curriculum, a more diverse curriculum. What do you think about that?
Well, when I read that part, there are some parts of that report I think are sensible, to be honest. So it's a balance. But that whole thing about creativity, I think this is again sometimes when politicians are talking about it, or some school people, I just think, it makes me cringe, because you just think you can't just say, like, make it sound like instead of teaching kids stuff, we should teach them to be creative, because that doesn't work. What you want is, and to be honest with you, when I first read that, I thought, my God, have we beamed back to sort of 2007? Because it felt like this is an old sort of, this is a bit out of touch sounding. What students need in terms of creativity is the opportunity at certain points in the curriculum where they can make choices and be creative. And that's not some generic sense of creativity. That's a sort of, let's see where in the curriculum makes sense for students to, say, explore an idea or be experimental, or just make a choice of something they'd want to do, rather than it always being directed by the teacher. But where does that come sensibly? Well, it comes sensibly when you already got a fairly secure knowledge base around things. And there are some subjects which allow it more than others. So generally speaking, the arts in education is becoming marginalised, and that's a real shame. So if you've got a strong arts curriculum in your school, creativity comes through that.
Yeah.
And you could debate, for example, there's a lot of really interesting debates about the English language curriculum and the nature of that. And, there's a whole debate to be had about whether we could have more creative writing in the curriculum and that type of thing. So it's more of a subtle debate about where in the curriculum would you place opportunities for students to be creative, rather than let's teach kids to be creative like it's a thing which happens kind of on its own, which is often how it comes across.
Catherine, do you have any thoughts on this? The whole sort of, David Blunkett basically said in his report that to Keir Starmer that, there should be more creativity in the curriculum, creative teaching, creative learning, and just children having the chance to be more creative and learn how to be more creative, if that's such a thing.
I think Tom kind of hit the nail on the head a little bit by saying that you can't be creative unless you know stuff about the subject, right? So unless you have been taught enough to then go off and play with a concept, there's absolutely no point in trying to say, well, we'll all just be creative. That'll do. In the same way as kind of with team skills or empathy or whatever, we teach that directly through the other things that we're teaching. It's not like I'm going to sit down and have a lesson on empathy, but I will have my students talk to each other about their views about, these two people have said these two answers. What do you think? And then they have to learn the empathy through listening to each other and what they think of each other, and their answers and all that kind of stuff. I think that it's hard from a kind of a mathematician's perspective. It feels like a very uncreative subject to a lot of people, but it's not. There's a lot of chance for my students to kind of play around with the maths and try and conjecture and generalize and find patterns and things for themselves. And they can't do that until I've given them the maths to work with. I kind of think the same thing about when I got asked if I wanted to do my 4th year of my degree. Like, I couldn't do a dissertation on maths unless I'd learned a load of maths before, because there was no way that I could look into a concept and find something a little bit new to investigate until I'd already interrogated all that already existed. So yeah, I think that there is a place for it, and it's nice that kind of somebody is trying to put a bit of a spotlight on this idea of students running their own kind of destiny and investigations, and actually using the knowledge that they've got. But it can't just be about those things. It's just not. It's not possible to do those things without having that base knowledge for me, basically.
Yeah.
Go
on, Tom.
Yeah, I mean, I just wish this whole debate was just just a much more sophisticated one. So let's instead of talking about slagging off the curriculum now, this is one thing that winds people up, is this idea that schools are sort of factory school prison ships, and there are a couple of commentators who always sometimes get space in the Guardian they don't deserve, where they talk about schools like these terrible exam factories, and I don't see that. I mean, I see a lot of teachers working really hard to teach kids, but really difficult things, and it's demanding. But where does the creativity come in? Well, it comes in things like in maths. Could we have, for example, the use of, say, goal-free problems, where you're sort of saying, how many angles can you find in this complex structure, and it's like the students have to then work out the right way to approach that, and that is creative, because you're thinking, where do I start? What should I do next? And it's decision making, and that's interesting, and that's being creative around a solution in maths. That's the type of thing that we could be talking about. Where does creativity come in science? Well, should it be possible at some point in, say, Key Stage 3 for every student to design an investigation? Maybe we could discuss that. Where would it fit? Where would be the best place to put it? And it's that type of thing. And is it an opportunity cost versus other things they could be doing? Well, you could probably find time once in 3 years to say, let's spend a few lessons designing investigations and following that through, and there's some creativity in that, and it's that type of discussion. And so I think there is probably an opportunity for students to have the occasional release valve where they're making choices and they're and so on, but it's always located in a subject discipline which is supporting that process. And that's where, in the hands of politicians, this gets lost, because they think of this creativity as this nebulous notion, rather than it being a deliberate, an explicit element of a very intentional curriculum design process. And they just don't understand enough about it to be talking about it sensibly, so then they mess it up. That's how I think.
I just want to say thanks to everyone for joining us so far. If you have a comment on anything we're discussing this morning, then you can hit that little icon in the bottom right hand side with a little speech bubble in it, and you can tweet us, and we will pin your tweet to the space, and we will discuss your comment or question as we go along. So if you want to get involved, that's how you do it. Or you can just tweet us at TT Radio 2022, and we will pin it that way. But that's the quickest way to do it. And please share the space, the little icon at the top with the sort of arrow in the paper tray. Click that, click copy, and then just tweet it out or tweet the link out. And share it around if you think this is a useful discussion. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I wanted to sort of move on to next was about cash. And I was going to ask you two questions. And Catherine, we'll start with you on this one. Part A, what's been the biggest waste of money in education since you started in it? And second, what should money be spent on or not spent on moving forward for the future? You're muted, Catherine.
Oh, yeah, sorry. It's just because I keep coughing and the dog keeps barking.
Oh, no.
So I think there's two bits of this for me. I'm really kind of against these massive getting people into teaching bursaries that no longer match salary. I think that is a massive waste of kind of the money that goes into education. I've got no issue with a bursary at all. You know, if you want to, you know, I got one myself. It really helped me to kind of go onto my skit and kind of feel like it was my job. But I earned more that year than I did for the next kind of 4 in my teaching career, which was bonkers. And there's a huge number of trainees that kind of get that bursary, maybe give it a little bit of a cursory amount of time in the profession and then leave because they didn't know what they wanted to do and they knew that this would pay them for a little while. And that really winds me up. And I also think that from a personal perspective, I'm kind of like very big on teacher CPD and development. And I think that sometimes the way that money is spent is not particularly very useful because it's not impactful and sustainable and kind of returned to. And so those things for me feel like the biggies money wise. And I think for me, it would just be about kind of making sure that those bursaries match salaries when you come in, rather than kind of being enticed by some big amount of, you know, there we go. I knew he'd start.
Albie agrees. He agrees.
He does, absolutely. You know, making sure that they match is going to keep people in the profession for the right reasons, and then making sure that the professional development is meaningful and purposeful, and you really feel invested in, a little bit like what Tom said earlier, is going to make a huge difference. And I'm not convinced that there is enough money in schools to make that a priority at the moment.
That's interesting. Tom, anything on this one of what's been the biggest waste of money in education in your time in it?
I think I mean, this is a bit ancient history really, but I think there was a big, and I've even forgotten its name, but sort of late 90s, early 2000s, there was this massive investment in teachers needing to upskill their IT skills.
Yeah.
There's an absolute car crash program where, you know, a lot of money went into these sort of folders of training materials and courses and training people to use a mouse on a computer, and you had to sort of pass these skills, and it was just an extraordinary thing. They just chucked all this money at it, and you can see what they wanted to do. They thought, we want education, let's upskill teachers, but it was also centralized and bureaucratic, and the whole thing came crashing down. And I don't think most people even finished the accreditation. It all just, so that to me was a nightmare, kind of overly centralized implementation thing. So that's really frustrating when you see that. But
interesting. Yeah, I mean the amount of money that you could argue has been wasted on IT in the last 20 years is like pretty huge, I would guess. Tom, what should money be spent on or not spent on moving forward for the future? Have you got any thoughts on that element?
Oh, well, I mean, I think generally speaking, I mean, if you're being sort of really idealistic about it, I mean, I actually think teachers' teaching load is just far too high, and it's so every bit of money you can put into staffing, I think, is really important. You know, schools need to have the capacity to have teachers not overloaded beyond what the loadings are supposed to be, at the salaries which are fair. So staffing budgets should be just absolutely maximal, and that to me is it. You know, you just need, and of course, where would money be spent on things like programs for investment when there's additional money? I think if there are, sometimes money gets thrown at the stuff at the end, the catch up and tutoring. I think that's an inefficient use of the money compared with, say, investing in early years and making sure that you've got children supported and the families and all the sort of wraparound care around schools early on to get parents into the school groove. And so where you can invest to tackle disadvantage and stuff, I think that should be around the early years setting rather than pupil premium flagged catch up clubs and stuff like that, which I just think are probably largely not touching the sides. Probably all that money that's been spent on tutoring is probably a total waste of money. I mean, you could probably not spend any of that money, and not barely any child would have made any difference to them. I'm not saying that some tutors aren't doing a good job with the individual case, but as a whole system across the whole piece, it's like chucking money at a problem hoping it will stick, and it's just not really the thing. But I still feel like another area, and this is where there's it's all about how much money you can spend in the right time. I still go to schools, and I know you talk about the condition, but I just think you rock up into the car park of some schools, you think, God, look at this place. It should be condemned. I mean, there are some schools that are just inappropriate buildings to teach in. And I think that, it's been acknowledged as a mistake, probably, the scrapping the building schools for the future. You need to continually invest in the fabric of the buildings. Like, we can't stop. We can't suddenly stop doing it. It needs to be a relentless focus. There are some school buildings which are still...
I must say, Tom, it wasn't me saying my desire was to teach in a shed.
No, of course not.
It wasn't sort of a dream I had as a child to sort of and teach in a shed for my entire career. But
the very best state schools in England are absolutely incredible. They're just the structure of the buildings, the investment. They're magnificent. And the worst ones are an absolute disgrace. And you think that those children going to those two schools deserve the difference they have, their experience. It's so wrong that they have that different level of facilities provided for them.
Yeah,
I think that is an injustice which we need to sort out.
Brilliant. Catherine, next question. Has what makes for a good teacher changed since you started teaching? And has the profile or demand changed?
I don't think fundamentally what makes a good teacher has changed. I don't think that... I kind of like what you were saying before. Like nobody kind of goes to work to not do a very good job as a teacher. That's not what we're about. And so I don't think fundamentally anything about being a teacher has changed and what makes you good, but I do think the perception of what makes a good teacher changes literally every year. So I think at the moment that kind of accountability kind of culture and kind of potentially chasing what Ofsted want or other kind of things that we think are good within the education system. Research became a very, very big thing in the last few years, and whether you're doing that or whether you're not doing that, and whether you're research informed or research led or anything like that, there's a lot of there's a lot of stuff there that kind of puts a lot more pressure, I think, on being a teacher than there ever has been before. I don't think that when I first started teaching, I felt that pressure so much. And it might have been just purely being oblivious, but I also think that there is more of this kind of creeping into lots of elements of kind of the way SLT are running schools, that culture of wanting to please. Ofsted in particular has been a really big feature of the past few years of my career. And I just, I'm not convinced that accountability and the kind of the demand there, I guess, is what you said, has changed. But fundamentally, being a good teacher hasn't changed. It's just that we feel, I think, a little bit less good at the job because of all of the pressures.
Tom, any thoughts on that? The question was...
I think I probably would have changed my view over the last few years. Because I've been as guilty as anyone of going through all the fads, and there's probably a time 20 years ago recruiting teachers and doing interviews and stuff where I might have been impressed by a jazz hands lesson with experts at envoys and all that sort of stuff. Whereas now I'm just thinking, oh, for God's sake, just teach them something, And so I feel like there's more of a kind of an understanding now about learning and how learning works, and the need to be inclusive in the sense of involving everybody in a lesson, in thinking rather than superficial, performative aspects of lessons. So I feel like there's a wising up that's happened, which I feel is very healthy. So I think those things that are important, and also probably understanding more about how teachers develop and valuing teachers who are reflective and open for discussions about the solving the problem of teaching better, rather than thinking they have to impress and perform and focusing on one-off lessons. So I feel like that has changed. And I think there are some probably more, there are some issues to do with relationships versus subject knowledge, and I don't know. I feel like it depends on the context, but I know that some schools I'm thinking of particularly now where they're really clear that the teachers who get strong outcomes they kind of are able to teach the students who are there and form some connection to them. They're not just sort of walking into that room going, I know maths pedagogy, receive my wisdom. They're thinking that they have a way of kind of flexing that approach to teach those students and bring them on a journey. And I feel like there's a kind of blending of that interpersonal with the subject knowledge, which we're looking for as the kind of holy grail. But I see so many teachers teach, hundreds. And what I think is so important to say is that there's no mold. I mean, teachers can be like wildly eccentric and just absolutely magnificent. and also sort of fairly kind of ordinary and magnificent because they're just there, and the kids love them because they're safe and secure and they know where they stand, and and I think that's I always try to give that message. There's no mold. Teachers can be whoever they want to be, and I see that everywhere.
Well, funnily enough, that was going to be my next question, which is there still space for so-called maverick teachers? Within the sort of have certain structures and systems and sort of instructions on what teachers should or have to do, meant that the more maverick teachers, and I'm not necessarily referring to ones who used to go for a ciggy in the staff room between lessons, that's not what I'm talking about necessarily, but the sort of maverick teachers, is there still space for them within the system?
Oh, I think so, but I figure like it depends on it depends a bit on with depends what their form of maverick is, because if it's just about going into the lesson and I don't know, Summer Heights High has got various issues as a program, but one of the characters on there, Mr. G, the drama teacher, who basically goes in and just like entertains himself and shows off to the children for every lesson. That's not the kind of maverick you want, where they're just there for amusement. That's not benefiting any of the kids. But if it means, just having a kind of personality where the students love it and it has a sort of slight motivational element, and it's a bit big, the big character in the room, that type of thing, but in a way which makes the students participate and work hard. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've seen them. I'm just thinking of them now. I'm thinking of some like just fantastic teachers. I think, wow, how do you keep that up all day? But they're enjoying themselves, and it motivates them to turn up to work because they.
Yeah, I mean, I can think of teachers who sort of taught me at school, or who I've come across since, who were very much of the ilk of they just, I wouldn't say they did what they wanted in the classroom, but they, if they wanted to like narrate and do question and answer or whatever for an entire lesson and the pen didn't hit the paper, that's what they would do, and it would work for the students. It would genuinely work for them, and the amount of times you would get that thing of, right, who's your favorite teacher? Oh, I love Mrs. So-and-so's lessons, and then they would ask why, and it would just be more to do. But then I suppose the counter to that is, well, yeah, if the student then says, oh, it's a personality, she's just hilarious and she's funny and she's interesting and her lessons are really engaging and interesting, I suppose there'll be those who would then say, oh yeah, but what are you actually learning?
Yeah. Well, I mean,
And
there's obviously, you've got to, I mean, I just think of, I mean, I just, my both of my children have been through school, and I often think of my own teachers, and I see those teachers. The teachers that my kids respected the most were ones where they were learning, but they kind of had a respect for their kind of passion and enthusiasm, but they weren't really a particular mode. I think the general kind of common ground would be that the teacher themselves had a real passion for the material, and I think that's something which I think as a university, like, total geek out on the physics and loving the geography teacher who's just a total geography nerd. I mean, you just respect that, because you think they're interested, and they kind of get over it. They tell you the sort of nerdy geology joke or something. You respect it because you think that's great. They're enjoying themselves, and my children have always felt that was good. They wanted the teacher to believe what they were saying that mattered, and I think as soon as teachers are a bit weary and wary about the actual curriculum, then you're all in trouble.
Talking of maverick teachers, Catherine, you were taught by my dad.
I was literally just going to say, you've got a vested interest in this question, because your dad was like the ultimate maverick teacher. He was amazing. And he only taught me in year 7, but I genuinely think that between him being so just so passionate about his subject, it made me want to carry on studying it for years. I'm a mathematician who did maths, further maths and chemistry at A level, but I kept doing history right up until AS, because I was so excited by the way that my history teachers were excited about their subject, and your dad probably started that for me.
That's nice.
And I think I try and do the same kind of thing for my kids. I had a math stress Monday. They get really mad at me if I don't wear my math stress on a Monday.
What is the math stress?
I've got 5 math stresses, Tom, and every single one of them has some form of numbers, equations, something like that on the dresses. Loads of us in the maths community have got them. So on a Monday I have to wear my math stress. If I don't wear it, the kids get very upset with me. I'm that stupid teacher that makes the stupid jokes about maths, like Tom's just said. Whenever the kids give me a coordinate and they say 2 2, I go, aha, a ballerina's favorite coordinate. And that kind of stuff, I think, is the reason that they kind of remember my lessons, because I am so overtly in love with my subject. And that doesn't mean that anybody else has to teach exactly like I do. All of my colleagues love the subject in their own way, and have a totally different way of teaching it. There is no kind of cookie cutter for what makes a good teacher. And we all have our own
Catherine,
are
you trying to make quotes for mugs there?
Yes, absolutely. I'll start selling them. I think that might be my little side hustle. No, I just think that there is no way to be a good teacher in one way or the other, and I think all of us have those little maverick tendencies in some way. No matter what the systems are, you're going to want to break out of them in some way for your own personality, I think.
I mean, just reflecting on what you said, I mean, one of the saddest, I wouldn't go as far as saddest, but a sad moment for me, which I actually remember, and I wrote about this years ago, was when I was about I must have been 14 or something. I specifically remember that my dad was really down at the dinner table because someone had basically said to him that his resources were outdated and stuff, and I knew that he spent hours on them himself, and I knew how passionate he was and all the rest of it. And yeah, okay, by that point he would have been in his sort of 50s. He's an experienced teacher. He'd been in that school a long time, but equally I knew that he was still doing a good job, and that really upset me actually at the time as a kid. I didn't know anything about teaching then. I was 14, but but it did upset me because I sort of knew what was going on, if you know what I mean, and how
it was personal.
And how a teacher can be an experienced teacher who's doing a lot of good things because they're not doing the latest thing, because they're not doing, I don't know, because they're not buying into something or doing something a certain way, they can be almost like demoted in the standing of what is
yeah,
good.
I think that's so interesting because sometimes you think of Maverick being sort of like wild, crazy, but actually in some schools Maverick could just be grinding out really functionally good lessons without any but bells and whistles. And then some people would feel that that's their quiet rebellion, that they're listening to all this stuff thinking, well, I don't do any of that, and I'm never going to use plickers. Don't tell me about plickers. I'm just going to ask some questions like I always have. And I think that we do need to respect that. In fact, one of the things I see all the time, and I do think it's really challenging after a career where you've gone through a system of a certain kind, to not judge people. And leaders and the system, and most of our leaders now have come up through a system where judging is like bread and butter. It's required. You used to get valued as a school leader if you were able to get the right judgment for a lesson when you walked in for 20 minutes compared with the person who was moderating that and all that kind of rubbish. And to unpick that, to sit in the lesson and just think, let's not judge as teachers, just embrace what they're doing and value them for who they are, and then see what else, what sorts of challenges they're having. I find a lot of leaders I work with find that really hard. It's like their instinct is to come out of a lesson and they immediately have a view of it and they want to tell that teacher stuff. And you think, well, don't judge yet. Just think, first of all, let's just sort of give thanks for that teacher being there. And they are them. They are that person. They're never going to change. They're that person. That is the person they are. What might you say to them to support them to evaluate their practice and craft it a bit differently? But don't try to talk about them as if you wish they were somebody else. And I find that some school leaders find that challenging. Like it's such a strong urge.
I think that's a hell of a point. And I think I've been guilty of that in the past. I've been guilty of sort of, I don't know how to say it, not in a bad way, but feeling like you need to say something. Like you say, make that judgment, or sort of immediately react to something you're seeing or you think, and not to actually go, hang on a minute, let's walk away from that for a bit, let's reflect, let's review, and let's think about their personality and what their sort of way of doing things is. I think the temptation is to project your own way onto others.
Yeah.
Because I think that's human nature in a way, to sort of, to want to impact others. And I think it usually will come from a good place. Like, I don't think it's like, oh, I want to judge someone because I want to make their life a misery. Of course not. But it sometimes can inadvertently, because it might be something they simply cannot do. It's like, you need to do this, but they just can't do it because they're not you.
No.
You know what I mean? Like,
and sometimes you realise you're asking someone to do something which is so against their nature that it would require them to almost change their entire personality. You think, well, that's never going to happen. So you've got to think, like, what might be a good way for you to, even within with a whole school thing where we're trying to get to achieve a certain approach. And some teachers are just more sort of socially shy and in their demeanour with a class, and they're quite formal and quite reserved. And you think, they're never going to be the big showy character. And some of those things I'm suggesting even in a training session about how you might go about it, you can never say you need to do this. You can just say that this is an idea you might want to look at, because some people are going, oh no, I can't imagine myself doing that. I often tell this story because it really struck me. There was a school I went to where there were two teachers side by side in the same corridor. And in a one class, there was this guy who was very formal, sort of shirt and tie, almost like snazzy dresser. It was almost like waistcoat and like a properly smart man, like he's in his 50s.
Yeah.
And he stood with his hands behind his back, and he would say, the way he asked questions was he'd say something like, so let's Jennifer, let's have from you, and he was like, it's very proper, very proper, and the kids loved him. This guy is so like maverick. And the teacher next door, same school, she would walk around the tables going, "All right, lovey, all right, darling, oh, that's beautiful, oh, gorgeous, lovely." And you think, well, these two teachers could not be more different, but in their own way, they're just great, you know. And the kids loved them, but both for being who they were. So you think, I can never make one of you be more like the other, but that's not the point. The point is, I personally wouldn't be like any of you, but that also isn't the point. The point is, are you, you know, using your personality and what you offer in the most effective way you can? And that's the whole spirit of a professional culture, where those people both feel valued for who they are, rather than feeling they're doing it wrong, you know.
Yeah, and I think that's particularly important when it comes to like new teachers, because if you're a trainee teacher or an NQT or whatever, I think you will take what someone else says, and it doesn't matter who it is, actually, particularly someone with more experience, but actually anyone, you could take what they say as gospel about you and about your teaching. So that's where feedback, I think, is really like important to get right, and only to say things that you absolutely need to say.
I was just going to mention this about trainees as well, because my trainee this year, I've noticed that when he teaches for my lessons, he uses the slide kind of profile that I use for my lessons. So like, he asked me to send him a lesson in his first week, and he uses very similar looking slides to me. But then when he teaches somebody else's lessons, he teaches on their performer and teaches more like them. And you know, he's right at the beginning of his career, so he's trying to emulate what he's seen work with that class before, which is absolutely brilliant. But also, I've then had to be very, very careful in my feedback, since I kind of clicked onto that I'm not trying to make him like a mini version of me, because that's not going to work. Like, I know that I don't teach like the person next door to me, and then they don't teach like the person next door to them. So why on earth should I expect him to teach like me? And then why would the other teacher that he's teaching with expect them to teach like them? And so it's really interesting, kind of coming at it from an ITT perspective. Thank you, Albie. As always agrees with his mum. So, you know, I think it's interesting to kind of consider that I've thought about that with ITT, and actually the past few years looking at other teachers in my kind of wider lead prac role. It's been about getting them to reflect, like Tom said, as opposed to kind of imposing my own views on them, because, as I say, there's no one good way to be a teacher.
Tom, do you think, because you do a lot of like coaching and the like, so when giving feedback to a teacher, are there any really key like do's and don'ts for you on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think for a start, I mean, this framing it in that way, I feel like the first thing is, I mean, and I do see this changing more and more in the system, which is great, as I feel like it's a conversation rather than a directional process. So whenever I'm giving feedback to a teacher, for a start, they are there. So, you know, I'm not writing this up and giving you my thoughts from on high, but also we are trying to reach a shared understanding of what the challenge is and what the solution might be, and that's the goal. So the first thing is to sort of throw out, to sort of focus on specific things you thought were interesting and why. So saying, that I like that moment, that was interesting. When you did that was interesting because that happened, and be very cause and effect. But then to open up the teacher to say, so where did you find it difficult? Where do you think when you're teaching, thinking, this isn't going as well as I would have liked, or this is a challenge for me, and get teachers to think about it in that way, and rather than saying, where do you think you went wrong, it's more like, where are you finding it difficult, and where do you think the students are finding it difficult? Because these are shared challenges that everyone's got. And when you approach the whole conversation from the point of view of solving the problem rather than doing it right or wrong, I think it's just a much more open conversation, and teachers will say, oh God, I know, I thought that would work, but I just don't think it did. And then the other thing is, you sometimes need to be prepared to be a reality check for a teacher, because when you're teaching, it's so full on. You don't always see everything. It's like watching a football match, from the stands. You can see where the players all are, but when you're on the pitch, your vision is only partial. You can't see the neat cross you could have made. When you're at the back.
That's a lovely analogy, because I always think to myself when I'm watching a game of footy, it's so easy to forget how difficult it is when you're on ground level to hit a pass 40 yards or something right to someone's feet, and to see that pass from ground level. But it's so easy watching football, because you watch 100 football games on TV a year. Or from the top of a football stand, it would be so easy to forget that.
Totally, yeah. And I saw a lesson recently, without sort of being too specific about it, but where it was a teacher who I thought was fabulous, like lovely guy, really enthusiastic, knowledgeable, really confident with the students, running a class with loads of discussion and input and probing, and it was all great. But the little lad next to me had no idea what was going on. And I was thinking, like, for the teacher to do all of that and also notice in real time every student's issues, it's just hard.
But I just think that, I personally, Tom, I think that's like, I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's so difficult to get everything right in any given lesson. And that's sort of relating back to what Catherine was saying earlier about the pressure to perform rising. And it's like, sometimes it's like what you said, Tom, earlier, of like, okay, this is the teacher, this is who they are. They're not perfect. No one's perfect. Let's just let them teach. Let's just see what happens. Let's just, like, that's not about saying, all right, we're not going to give any feedback. I'm not suggesting that, because if you're a self-reflective practitioner, which most teachers, I think, are anyway. I think, I don't think there's many teachers who literally walk out of a day of teaching and go, and don't even have a thought about it in their head. Some will, but not many. Most will have some form of analysis going on. But it's so easy to make someone think they've got to change, or make someone think what they're doing isn't good enough, or make someone think that, and maybe that's the teacher's fault as well for picking up on that one bit, because you just reeled off a whole list of really positive things. Yeah. So, and I know I've seen a few people tweet, actually, Adam Boxer tweeted this just yesterday about teachers being able to take feedback on as being the most important thing he would look for when recruiting a teacher in, is the ability to take feedback. And I get that, but equally, teaching is personal because it's about relationships, and it is so easy to take feedback personally, and to take feedback, especially from someone you don't know. Like you say, if it's a one-off observation,
I'm rubbish feedback, but I can discuss an issue. So, like, if someone, I always think of a lesson that I taught where I had an inspector in, and I still think about it now, because it was a lesson where I was trying to sort of push the boundaries a bit and make it a bit more challenging, because I was thinking that was important. And the inspector noticed that two of the students at the back were finding it hard, and I probably let them flounder a bit too long, so it wasn't a deal for them. But rather than sort of, this downgraded my lesson, and they're totally focused on it. They're saying, you should have done this and you should have done that. And that was the whole nature of the conversation. And I was thinking, actually, overall, this class is doing really well. And, my hackles are raised. I wanted to say to them, well, I'd like to see you try, because actually, we're doing pretty well, and come and stand where I'm standing. But so rather than saying to me, yeah, God, how do you get those two lads at the back to be involved when there's so much else going on that's really good, and how else could you address it? And then I could have said, yeah, I know, I do need to think about them, and I could have been open to the conversation. But because it came from the angle of, let me give you some feedback about where you went wrong, I was get out of my class. The spirit of it, especially from strangers, I think is really a big part of it. If you're not receiving feedback, I don't think it's just down to the teacher to say you need to be good at receiving feedback. The feedback needs to be constructed in an intelligent way, with the teacher being part of a discussion.
I think just the last 10 minutes or so, if anyone wants to call in, by the way, and you have a view on this, we've started to talk about giving feedback, receiving feedback as teachers, then please hit the little request button on the bottom left-hand side. There's a little blue mic icon. So if you have a question or a comment, that you want to make, you can just hit that and we'll invite you in and you can kind of get involved in the conversation. I mean, one thing I was going to sort of add on this issue of feedback is a comment made by Miss B. And you can see it actually pinned at the top, Catherine and Tom. She says, I think it's important to lead by example. I find teachers find it hard to receive feedback if they don't think the person giving the feedback is credible. It's interesting, that word credible, though, because what is credible? Catherine, what do you think?
I think that's really, really subjective as well, because, and I think, but it almost comes back to the same point as Tom just made. It was a stranger that walked into his classroom and made that judgment and kind of said those things in a judgmental way. And so that felt less, as a person, you're less receptive to that, because it's like, well, you don't even know me. You don't know that this is my everyday. This is one lesson you've ever seen. And so, like, that's part of credibility, I think. But then also there's that level of credibility of, like, how much do they do this? Have they been a teacher themselves? When did they last teach, etc., which I think, for lots of people is a really big factor in how much they're going to listen to what somebody has to say. It's like their level of experience, and particularly, I think, experience in teaching your subject as well. Particularly sometimes, I think there's a lot of talk often about, someone coming in, particularly maybe Ofsted, and saying, this is what you should have done, but they're, a history teacher and they've been watching a maths lesson.
I think we've started talking about credibility, and Tom's literally left to go and update his LinkedIn. Like, bloody hell. He's thought, bloody hell, I forgot to update my LinkedIn. It's been out of date for months. But yeah, no, like, I think that, to be fair, I think that can happen, though, even in a school, can't it? If someone because you imagine, right, the only way, really, that someone would get a real, true, proper take on what you're doing is if they were in your classroom for 80 to 90% of the lessons over like months. That's my thinking. I just don't know. Like, you could pick up on little things for that particular lesson, but as a teacher, as a whole, like, I don't know.
I think the shift that Tom's talking about having these kind of professional conversations about it as opposed to imposing these judgments is probably the biggest thing that I've seen change in this since I started teaching. At the beginning, there was still very much of a, like, judgment on your individual lesson kind of mentality. Whereas now, when I'm kind of popping in and out of lessons, I mean, I do it all the time. I'm absolutely ridiculous for just wandering into a lesson and seeing what's going on.
Yeah.
When I'm free, I really enjoy just going and seeing what other people are doing. But about them kind of leading that conversation then and saying, oh, you were doing this, tell me more about it, or, leading that conversation in that way, I think is much, much better, and actually maybe gives you the credibility a little bit as well, because it's not about you dictating what is good and what is bad. It's about feeling that kind of trust both ways, that you both feel each other is credible, I think is really important as well.
I think that's so interesting. I mean, I think the thing is, and this is where, people doing this need to, obviously there are different cultures. I know some schools where, it's still very top down, the SLT walk around and they'll go to the teacher and say, do this, do that. And sometimes we still have people dropping in feedback comments onto a system. And I think it's weird. I think it's weird and rude even to be teaching and then go to your pigeonhole and find, or your inbox and find you've been given some feedback by someone who dropped in. I just think that's just ridiculous. And I would never do that. So when I go to schools and sometimes people ask me for feedback, I just say, well, it's not really, that's not, why I was there. I was there to sort of just get a sense of the whole school, and we can discuss the issues when we've got time. But I'm not going to give you feedback as such unless we have a structure to have a conversation. I once recently, I think this brought it into relief for me. Recently, I was in a school in the Wirral where we were doing a really interesting process with teachers observing other lessons in some.
That's where me and Catherine are from, by the way.
I thought Tom was just going to, like, whoop then when you said that, because I did. I was just on mute.
No, it's great. It was some lovely trust up there, and we were doing this process looking at lessons across the trust. And one of the lessons we saw was a year 1 PE lesson, and I was with these two other teachers who were year 6 teachers. And I was saying, have you taught year 1 PE? And they were saying no. And I said, nor have I. So the three of us are watching this lesson that none of us have ever taught. and we wouldn't know how. So what's our use to the teacher? Well, we were saying, well, for a start, we're not going to lay in and tell the teacher anything. We're just going to ask them some questions. But you can say to that teacher, wow, we noticed some things. That what was happening there, and was that good? Were you happy with the standard there? What were you finding hard about that? And were all the children doing as well as you'd have hoped? And you could ask loads of questions for that teacher to explore the process with them. But you can't weigh in and start giving your view because you're a total non-expert in.
But also, Tom, just to add in there as well, and I'll be honest here, I don't think in my career, when someone who's been observing, and it could be a colleague, it could be a leader, it could be an Ofsted inspector, it could be whoever, I don't think I've ever been 100% truly myself as a teacher. I don't think I have. Even if it's just the odd little thing, that I've done that I wouldn't normally do, or that, I don't know, like just not feeling myself. Like, for example, would I be humorous? Would I even attempt to be humorous when there's someone else watching the lesson?
Well, I think that's funny. Yeah, I get that. I have this conversation all the time where people say to me, "Oh, I wasn't sure if it was right for me to do X," and I do think this is where we need to sort of get through this. Like sometimes, like, the most ridiculous example, well, not ridiculous because it was legitimate. That this teacher said to me, the obvious thing was that the students were finding stuff too difficult, and she needed to go back and explain things again. And it's clear to everyone, including her. But because she felt like that would look bad to not continue, and it would mean that she'd actually have gone back over a few steps and think of some questions to ask to sort of re-explain. And she wasn't sure whether that would be viewed as some sort of failing to not have taught them successfully. She carried on, and it was just digging a bigger and bigger hole. The children not knowing, and that was literally her being shackled by the rabbit in headlights feeling of I'm being observed, whereas her instinct, if no one had been there, would have been to go back over it. And you're thinking, how weird, like to be in a system where that has your inhibition because of being observed has created that feeling. So we had to really talk about that. And I was sharing that experience with this SLT of the school, saying, no, the culture that you've got at the moment has this vibe where people are worried about doing the right thing to the point where they'll do a weird thing. And they were quite open about that, saying, we probably are too top down, and maybe we need to think about the messaging we're given to the teachers when we observe. And I don't know. I think that's something to really explore.
I think it goes back right to that point you made right at the beginning, talking about the culture of the school, because if the culture of the school is like being observed is no big deal, which it was at my last school in particular, people walked in and out all the time and just wanted to get a sense of how the school was running, then that feels very different. I think at the beginning of that school, I definitely felt like I was being watched all the time, and kind of changed a little bit when they walked in. But by the end, I didn't even notice. I could have like 5 visitors in a lesson, and it just was nothing to me. I knew it wasn't really necessarily always about me unless I'd specifically asked, or it was a specific, focus for the school that week or whatever. And the culture of that changed how I think about observations entirely because of that, and the feedback I then got because of it. So yeah, I think it's a really big thing, that culture, going right back to the beginning of the conversation. It's definitely the biggest thing I think that on a small school level we can do.
Yeah, I think what I always say to school leaders about this, and it's easier said than done, of course, but is to, every time you observe a lesson or talk to a teacher, you've got an opportunity to reinforce the culture you want to have, which is that the teacher was glad you came in, that they felt supported, and they kind of would welcome you back any time, because the process was, oh, that was cool. You came in, you've helped me, you've pushed me along. I don't feel judged. I feel supported. And then you're onto a winner where you can sort of pop in any time and it's all supported. And I know schools where that is absolutely what it's like. And but the opposite is, if after you've dropped in and the word around the staff room is, oh, I've just had so and so on my lesson, God, it was so stressful, and they give me all this feedback, and the reputation of the whole process is the opposite. Leaders have got that in their hands every single time, and you can change the culture by just simply walking the talk of that.
Yeah, goodness me. I mean, we could go on all day. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. But I just want to say thanks ever so much, Tom and Catherine, because it's been an amazing discussion. Particularly the second half. It was brilliant. So thanks ever so much for coming on. If anyone wants to listen back to this, it's going to be available as a podcast later on today. So if you follow Teachers Talk Radio on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or any of those, then you can listen to it on there during the week, and we'll post a link to that through Teachers Talk Radio. In 30 minutes' time, you've got Brent Poland coming up on Teachers Talk Radio. So if you want to listen to him, you just have to click on the TTR website and click Listen Live, and it'll go straight through to Brent's show. If you're interested in hosting yourself, make sure you get in touch with us. If you are a teacher in a school, then please DM us on TT Radio 2022 and just say, I want to host. And then we will hit you up, and we will make sure we can get you set up, and it'd be great to hear from you. Final thing is, tomorrow night I've got part 2 of this. Exactly the same, future of education. It'll probably be very far ranging. We'll probably go off on many tangents like today, but I've got Daisy Christodoulou and Khalil Rouse tomorrow from 7:30. And also just a final mention and thanks to our sponsors of the show, which are With a Slack Group and John Catt Educational, who both kindly sponsor this show. Have a good rest of the day, and thanks everyone for tuning in, and we will be back with you again soon.